this is not a new concept. Ben Franklin said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We have the ancient Chinese medicine saying the wise physician treats a disease before it occurs. So, I mean, these are not new ideas, but we've gotten, unfortunately, really far away from them. We need to return to the wisdom of our ancestors. And it's actually, ironically, more important now than it probably was in their time.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Toda Labrada Gore. Our guest today is Chris Kresser. Chris was recently named one of the 100 most influential people in health and fitness by Greatest.com, along with Michelle Obama, Dr. Oz, Dr. Wheel, and Dr. Mercola. Excellent company. Chris is well known as a practitioner of functional medicine and the New York Times bestselling author of the Paleo Cure. In today's discussion, he emphasizes the wisdom of our ancestors' way of life and how it should help shape our lifestyle and diet today. Wise Traditions is supported by Green Pasture Products, offering fermented cod liver oil, concentrated butter oil, and coconut oil in a variety of products and blends. Visit greenpastureproducts.com. And the Weston A Foundation. We want to highlight two events coming up in the Northeast, in Vermont and New York, this June. Nourish Vermont Traditional Foods and Health Gathering is June 2nd to the 4th, and Real Foods Retreat in Clear Lake, New York is June 3rd to the 7th. For information on either event, go to the westonaprice.org website and click on events. And now, on to our conversation. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Chris.
Thanks, Hilda. It's a pleasure to be here.
One of your first books you wrote, I think, was called Your Personal Paleo Code, and that really intrigued me. Tell me what gave you the idea to write that book.
Well, humans are animals. Like other animals, there is a certain diet that we evolved to eat. And this is a concept known as species-appropriate nutrition. And it's, anyone who works in zoology or any other field where they study animals will know that animals thrive on a particular diet that they evolved on. And if they get too far away from that diet, they start to develop disease. And so it's the same for humans. We, for 77,000 generations, ate primarily meat and fish and some wild fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and starchy plants. And today, the top 6 foods in the American diet are grain-based desserts, bread, sugar-sweetened beverages, pizza, alcohol, and fried chicken dishes.
Oh my gosh.
So I'd say we've strayed pretty far away from our native ancestral diet, and we have this epidemic of chronic modern disease as a result of that. And so the concept of paleo is that we want to move back toward this ancestral diet that our bodies are familiar with, and if we do that, we'll have better health. So that's the kind of core paleo concept. But the problem with paleo as it was initially presented is that we aren't the same as we were 10,000 years ago. Most of our genes are the same, but there have been some significant genetic changes in the past 10,000 years. In fact, some researchers have argued that as much as 10% of our genome has shown evidence of selection. And that means that we may be able to tolerate some foods that our ancestors couldn't tolerate. So lactase persistence is a really good example of this. And this is, 10,000 years ago, none of our ancestors could digest lactose, which is the sugar in milk. There was no need for us to be able to do that because there was no source of lactose in our diet at that point other than mother's milk. So after we were weaned and finished nursing, we lost the ability to digest lactose because, we hadn't domesticated cows yet and we weren't consuming dairy products. But about 10,000 years ago, that did happen, and a population domesticated cows, and then we acquired the ability to digest lactose as adults, and then that spread throughout the world to the point where today, in some parts of the world, well over 95% of people are able to digest lactose, like in Scandinavia, for example. And of course, it's lower in other parts of the world. And there are other examples of that, but the long and the short of it is that today, some of us are able to digest dairy products and properly prepared grains and legumes, and these can be a healthy part of the diet when they're eaten in moderation and they don't replace more nutrient dense foods. And so the idea behind the personal paleo code was that paleo is a great starting place, but we can expand it from there to meet our individual needs. And above and beyond what I've just been talking about, each person is different. So we have, changes that have happened since the Paleolithic era, but then, the perfect diet for someone who's 60 pounds overweight and primarily sedentary office worker is going to be very different than the perfect diet for someone who is training for an Olympic weightlifting competition. Maybe that goes without saying, but that's often overlooked in the discussion about diet. So what's good for you may not be exactly what's good for me. And that's the whole idea behind personalization.
Dr. Price, whom we base our principles on in the Weston Price Foundation, he traveled all around the world to see who the healthiest peoples were, and they ate varied diets. So this kind of goes along with what you're saying. In other words, the people in Alaska were feasting on fish and whale blubber and seal oil and all these things, while the people in Africa were drinking goat's blood and eating, meat, maybe having some wild honey here and there. But their diets were varied, and yet they were all strong and good because they were eating the foods that worked best for their bodies and where they lived in the world.
Right.
I just want to agree with you that what you were saying about ancestral foods makes so much sense. Principle number 1 of the Weston Price Foundation is Dr. Price found no refined or denatured foods among the people groups who were healthiest. So the stuff that's on the supermarket shelves with a million ingredients is not the stuff that our bodies can understand or may ever understand. Do you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to see some pretty significant evolutionary biological changes for us to be able to extract nutrients from some of those foods. And even if we did, the foods just don't have very many nutrients to begin with. So it's almost impossible to imagine a scenario where processed and refined flour and sugar could nourish us to the extent that nutrient-dense foods like organ meats and animal products and vegetables and fruits could. I mean, it just can't work that way. So yeah, it's, as you said, the brilliance of Weston Price's work was that he identified core principles that were the same across all of these varied diets around the world, but then recognized that there's a wide variation in what humans can thrive on based on their geography and their genetics and biology, and then even more specifically, individual differences.
And that was part of the reason you wrote your personal paleo code, right? Because you were saying, I need something else in my diet other than this starting point of the paleo. What were those things that you were looking to add that you knew your body could probably tolerate and actually was craving?
I'm a clinician, a functional medicine clinician, first and foremost. And so I treat hundreds of patients with chronic illness. And I saw that the diet that was right for one patient was not necessarily right for the other patient. And I saw that in my own experience as well. So the book really came out of my direct experience working on a one-on-one basis with hundreds of patients with chronic illness. And I was troubled by these, every year there's a new diet book that promises the answer, whether that's a low carb or low fat or intermittent fasting or this or that. And oftentimes those diet books are written by people who aren't working with patients or, who don't have a lot of experience treating people with different health conditions. And they write it out of their own experience, which is great, and that's valid. But what they may not realize in their enthusiasm for the approach that worked for them is that, what worked for them may not work for other people. But I think when you have a perspective of being a healthcare practitioner and you get to experiment with this stuff, not only on yourself, but with a lot of other people, you gain an appreciation of the importance of biochemical individuality. So within the context of paleo, I found that some of the biggest problems were the early days of paleo. The early adopters were actually converts from Atkins, I think, and other really low carb diet approaches. And so they brought their low carb ethos over from those diets and kind of superimposed it on paleo, and the default paleo approach became a low carb diet. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, if someone is eating, like I said, those top six U.S. foods, like grain based desserts, muffins and cookies and bread and sugar sweetened beverages, which are all super high carb foods, and then they switch to paleo and they eat only non-starchy vegetables, meat, and maybe a few sweet potatoes a week and some fruit. That's going to be a pretty super low carb diet, unless they're really trying to add carbohydrates in the form of other starchy plants like plantains or taro or yucca, or because they've eliminated all grains and other really dense carbohydrate sources. So I see a lot of patients who come to me who are on what I call an accidental low carb diet. So, they've switched to paleo. They didn't really even intend to go on a low carb diet, but just the nature of switching to paleo and not trying to get more carbs into their diet put them on a low carb diet. And maybe initially they lose weight and they feel better, but after a few months, they start to feel worse and they develop things like insomnia and mood disturbance and low energy. And that's because carbohydrate intake should be personalized based on a whole variety of factors that include genes, genetics, activity level is probably the biggest one. If a woman is pregnant or nursing, she's probably going to need more carbohydrates. So there are a lot of things to consider. And if someone who is, let's say, active person doing a lot of exercise and already somewhat lean, they're probably not going to do very well on a really low carb diet. So, that's one example. And then the others would be things like dairy products and what I call gray area foods. So these are foods that were not consumed by our Paleolithic ancestors, but modern research has shown that they're healthy when they're well tolerated and when they don't completely replace more nutrient dense foods. So these would be things like full fat and fermented dairy and properly prepared legumes and even properly prepared grains that, all of which Weston Price talked about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, what is the role of fats in the diet as you see it?
Well, fats are a primary energy source. The body, along with glucose, can convert fat into usable energy. So they're very important from that perspective. They also play important roles in the nervous system and the brain. A large percentage of the dry weight of the brain is DHA, which is the long chain omega-3 fat. And those long chain omega-3 fats play really important roles in the brain. But I know most of your listeners are not fat phobic. It's pretty hard to be in the Weston Price Foundation and be fat phobic, which is great. It's one of the things that drew me to it in the first place. But I think this is finally starting to change even in the dominant culture. We're seeing popular books. For example, Mark Hyman just published, who's a very renowned functional medicine clinician, and he just launched the Center for Functional Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, and he's all over the popular media, Dr. Oz, and all the talk shows, and he was a guy who advocated more of a plant-based diet for many years, but he has come around himself and is now he's written a book on the health benefits of fat. So and he really believes that. So this is a big sea change that we're witnessing here, I think.
And it's so satisfying, isn't it? I think some people say when they try to eat low fat, they end up compensating for that choice by overloading on sugar because their body's looking for something that fat provides.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's why low-fat diets are often really ineffective, either because the compliance is low or because they may solve one problem but cause several others. So for most people, it's not really a viable solution.
Tell me a little bit about your story, Chris.
Like many other people who are drawn to this, I had my own health challenges. My early 20s, I was traveling in Indonesia doing some surfing and got really sick with a mysterious tropical illness that took me about 10 years to recover from. And one of the significant turning points in that recovery process was discovering the work of Weston Price. I was in a bookstore on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and I saw Nourishing Traditions, Sally Fallon's book, poking out there, and I picked it up and started reading it in the bookstore, and it made a ton of sense. And then strangely synchronous event happened there where someone walked up behind me and saw me reading the book, who was already doing a lot of, cooking that way and had experienced the health benefits, and said, oh, this is, this, you really need to check this out. And it turned out that person ended up being a really close friend of my future wife. So it was a really kind of interesting thing where I feel like the stars aligned to,
Yes.
introduce me to that. And this was many, many years ago, probably more than 10 years ago. So that really helped. There were a number of things that brought me back to health, and I was already eating not too far away from the Weston Price approach, but there were some things that really clicked in and accelerated my healing process. And then I started to refine and tweak it, myself. I found that grains, even when they were prepared properly, and legumes didn't work that well for me. And so that's where I went on to discover paleo and then kind of modify that. And really the diet that I advocate now at this point is, you could see it as kind of a hybrid between paleo and Weston Price. And depending on the person, it could actually look exactly like Weston Price, or it could be closer to strict paleo, depending on what their particular needs are.
Interesting. Well, what a cool thing. I love your story. And then how did you get into this field? Did you decide, oh, I'm going to study nutrition because this has meant so much to me?
Let's see. When I was traveling and I got sick, I at that time didn't have any intention of going and becoming a clinician. But then after I got sick and started to recover my own health, people started to ask me, other people who witnessed what happened started to ask me questions. And after a while, it became clear that I had learned a lot in my own experience that could help other people. And, I recognized in my own journey back to health that there were not very many. There were definitely some key players along the way that helped me in tremendous ways, but it wasn't there. I recognized that the current healthcare system, the way it's set up, was pretty woefully inadequate, and that we needed a new form of healthcare that would be able to address the challenges of the chronic disease epidemic that we're facing. Because I'm sure all your listeners would agree that our current system is not set up for that. And so I wanted to be a part of that change. And I went back to school to study integrative medicine. And that's how I ended up where I am now.
We want to stop and acknowledge our sponsors, Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products produces fermented cod liver oil and concentrated butter oil in a variety of flavors in liquid gel and capsule form. They also offer organic virgin coconut oil, virgin coconut ghee, and a complete oil blend that includes all of the nourishing oils. Lastly, they produce skincare balms and various byproducts that enrich the soil and feed of farm animals. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. We want to highlight 2 events coming up in early June. In Vermont, June 2nd to the 4th, is Nourish Vermont Traditional Foods and Health Gathering. Learn the core principles of traditional diets inspired by the teachings of the Weston A. Price Foundation, and explore how embracing this lifestyle can contribute to one's health, wellness, and longevity. Sally Fallon Morell will be there along with a number of well-known health experts and speakers. And in New York, pamper yourself with a getaway of beauty and delicious traditional foods, June 3rd to the 7th. There will be back-to-back events, and seminars include sessions and workshops on cultured dairy and beverages, summer soups and stocks, and cooking with essential oils. Again, you can find more information on both of these events on our website, westonaprice.org. Click on events. And now, back to the conversation. Can you tell me a story of some patient that you've seen a turnaround because of some dietary changes? You must have so many, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say probably, every patient that I see would fit into that category, because we start with diet and lifestyle for everyone. And most people who come to me have already been following my blog, or, I have a pretty unusual patient population in that they've already been on the Weston Price or paleo diet for several years, typically, before they get to see me, and maybe those changes have helped them a lot, but they haven't completely resolved their condition, and so they need a deeper level of investigation. But I still see occasionally patients who maybe, they got referred by one of my patients, it's their mom or their sister or someone who's not necessarily into this stuff, and to be honest, those are the most fun patients to see because it's like shooting fish in a barrel, kind of. It's like, I know that, for example, we had the other day just heard back from a 8-year-old kid that I had been working with, and his mom actually, he came to see me, or his mom brought him to see me because he was having really significant behavioral issues at school. And he was, at one point had been diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Later they changed the diagnosis to, it's maybe Asperger's. And then at some point it was like a sensory overload kind of disorder. So it's, somewhere on that behavioral spectrum disorder, and to the point where he had been kicked out of a couple different schools, and it was really extremely problematic and difficult for the family. And they were kind of at their wits' end, and they had taken him to therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a lot of other types of work that are aimed at addressing things from the emotional or psychological side, which is important, definitely. And he did have some positive changes there, but they wanted to look at a deeper level with what was happening physiologically. So we got him on we did some food intolerance testing, and we got him on a strict paleo type of diet. And then we discovered that he had some fungal yeast overgrowth problem in the gut, and some, just general gut dysbiosis. And so we took gluten out of his diet and put him on a paleo type of diet, and then treated the fungal overgrowth. And I just, as I mentioned, heard back from the mom, and they got a phone call from his teacher at school who said, who is this kid that you're sending to school? Because I don't recognize this kid. He's completely different. His behavior has changed. And what's amazing about these situations is even the kids that young realize it, and they like it. They like feeling more in control and better adjusted. And he's raving about how good he feels, and it's really satisfying to see that. And that was primarily through dietary change. There was some treatment of the fungal overgrowth, which probably occurred because he was eating so much processed and refined carbohydrate, flour and sugar. But it was mostly dietary changes that led to that. And that's a change that, according to his psychologist, that they've never seen a change that significant, even with all of the drugs that they throw at those problems. So she was very curious to learn more about what we had done.
Oh, that's so fantastic. And it sounds so rewarding. I look around and I see kids in the US today, and they all seem to be struggling. I saw a child the other day who he was like 8 years old actually, and he was having like a little unhappy tantrum because he didn't want to eat cereal. He collapsed on the floor crying as if he were 2. And this was very distressing to me on a number of levels. First of all, I don't think cereal is good for you. But and so I'm kind of joking about that. But the truth is, it was sad to see the behavioral issues he had, and I'm sure he would just be labeled as a normal kid.
Absolutely. And there's actually a research paper that I read recently that addresses this. It was a pretty provocative title. It was called, Is it terrible twos, or is it a dysfunctional gut microbiome? And so the researchers are basically arguing that a lot of what we consider to be normal developmental phases, in terms of, difficult behavior, may actually not be normal. It may be a result of physiological changes that happen because of our modern diet and lifestyle. It's not to say that there aren't real developmental changes that kids go through. Of course there are, but right. I think it's important to understand the difference between what's common and what's normal, because those are two very different things.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. As a young mom, when my child would get an ear infection, for example, other parents would reassuringly say to me, "Oh, all children get ear infections. That's so, it's they would say it's normal."
Right.
But what it is really is it's common,
exactly.
But that doesn't mean it's normal.
Absolutely. And, we could say the same thing about obesity. Now, it's extremely common. Now, 38% of the U.S. population is obese, according to the latest statistics, and 2/3 are overweight. So, if you were like an alien coming down to study this population, you could reach the conclusion that it was normal to be overweight or obese and abnormal to be lean, right? If you were just looking at it and had no idea of what was normal. But we know from studying human history, anthropology, and just basic physiology that it's not normal to be overweight and obese, but it's extremely common to the point where it's become somewhat normalized. So there are many examples of that.
Yes, and my heart goes out to the general population. Chris, what do you think it's going to take for people to kind of wake up and realize, oh my gosh, we do need to return to our ancestral traditions. We do need to eat whole, real foods. What do you think it's going to take?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think my answer varies depending on how optimistic or pessimistic I'm feeling at any given time. I think certainly on an individual level, unfortunately, for some people, what it takes is having a major health crisis. And it would be awesome if that wasn't the case, but it simply is for a lot of people. A lot of folks are just on autopilot when it comes to diet, and they eat what's available and what they're accustomed to eating, and they're focused on other things until they develop a chronic disease, and then they start paying attention. And so often it's a personal health crisis, but on a society-wide level, I think we're starting to experience and have been experiencing for several years a cultural health crisis where the disease management system that we have is already falling apart at the seams. It's not effective in serving people. It's not equipped to deal with chronic disease. It was really set up as kind of an acute disease care type of system. It's not good at promoting health, and it's not good at treating chronic disease. And if you look at the projections for the future of this system in the US, it's projected to be bankrupt by 2030, and the percentage of GDP that healthcare expenditures will consume is just going up and up and up. And I think the writing's on the wall. It's not going to last. And so we're going to have to find viable alternatives that are more based on prevention. And that's, of course, where nutrition plays such a big role. And so on the positive side, we are already seeing some changes, like with, as I mentioned, Mark Hyman starting the Center for Functional Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. That's getting a lot of media attention. And if we can start getting more attention on a bigger scale, not just, with those of us in the Weston Price Foundation and these grassroots efforts, which are really important and have really driven and built the whole movement, but even expanding that out into a broader scale is, I think, the next step.
Wow, you are so right. I'm thinking about the difference I heard described once, that Western medicine sees the patient's body as a battleground. So we're going to fight cancer, we're going to fight diabetes or what have you. And the patient's body is the battleground. Whereas Eastern medicine sees it more as a garden where we want to cultivate health. Mm-hmm. And when I hear you talking about prevention. It sounds like you're leaning toward that prevention, cultivating health perspective.
Absolutely. This is not a new concept. Ben Franklin said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We have the ancient Chinese medicine saying, the wise physician treats a disease before it occurs. So, I mean, these are not new ideas, but we've gotten, unfortunately, really far away from them in our current healthcare or disease management, as I prefer to call it, system. So we need to return to the wisdom of our ancestors. And it's actually, ironically, more important now than it probably was in their time, because these chronic diseases that are by far the number one cause of death in the developed world, like cardiovascular disease and obesity and diabetes, these were relatively unheard of, even just a couple hundred years ago. But certainly if you look back 10,000 years to our Paleolithic ancestors, they didn't die of these conditions, and they didn't experience these conditions. And it's not just because they didn't live long enough to get them.
Right.
They did have shorter lifespans on average, but that was because they were exposed to the elements. There was tribal warfare. They had high rates of infant mortality and complete lack of emergency medical care. And there have been studies that have showed that when contemporary hunter-gatherers have access to even the most rudimentary emergency medical care, they live lifespans equivalent to our own in the modern world. But the difference is they reach those ages without acquiring all of the modern inflammatory diseases that characterize our old age, like Alzheimer's and diabetes and high blood pressure and things like that. So there's a lot we can learn from our ancestors.
Absolutely. I got to go to Kenya last year, and I met a man who was over 100. He was so old, he didn't even know how old he was. But he was living exactly as you said. I'm sure he's had access. He's, outside in Nairobi. He's had access to medical care if he needed it. Mm-hmm. But he was like, I never had shots. I never, I've just eaten the way of my ancestors and I'm doing fine. And he was able to hold a conversation with me. He was not infirm. He did not use a cane. Like, it was amazing to behold and think, yeah, people can live like this and did live like this. If it weren't for predators and warfare and some of the things you mentioned, they definitely would have lived a lifespan as long as ours, if not longer. So it was a beautiful thing to behold. Well, actually, we have to wrap up soon, but I have two more questions. One question is, well, you see so many people coming to you for help. What is one of the biggest threats you see them facing with their health? What's one of the biggest issues they have when they come to you?
I think autoimmune disease is probably the most rapidly growing kind of scary problem that we're facing. The most recent statistics I've seen suggest that 1 in 4 women will now suffer from an autoimmune disease and 1 in 6 men. So this is just incredible if you think about it, especially, like I said, given that autoimmune disease was relatively rare even 50 to 60 years ago in the US, much less 10,000 years ago, where it was practically non-existent according to what we can determine. And I mean, in contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, it's practically non-existent. And still in most parts of the developing world, it's practically non-existent. So this is a real epidemic, because most autoimmune diseases are, there's some that are mild, but there's some that are obviously quite serious and life-threatening, like multiple sclerosis and things like lupus. And they're not easy to treat, and they're not curable, at least according to our current understanding. So I think that these autoimmune diseases are a direct result of what we call mismatch, which is a conflict between our genes and our biology on the one hand and the modern environment that we're living in on the other. And autoimmune disease is a direct result of that mismatch.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that evolutionary mismatch, because I saw it in one of your blogs and I didn't know what it meant, but now I do. I see. Fascinating. So let me ask you one more question. I often ask my guests this at the end. Chris, what is one thing you would recommend that the listener do to improve their health?
Right now, I've been really spending a lot of time examining the relationship between stress and disease. And I think it's the elephant in the room for most of us. Especially people that are listening to the show, are probably already thinking quite a bit about their nutrition, maybe even about exercise and things like sleep. But the amount of stress we experience in the modern world is also another area where we're mismatched with our current environment. And our stress response system was really evolved in a time where the stressors were much better defined and more acute. So, maybe you're out for a walk on the plane, you're gathering some food, and you get confronted by a lion, and deal with that threat, or you don't if you weren't lucky. But then you go back, to the fire, and things have settled down, and you're back into the relaxed state. And our stress response system is relatively binary; it's either on or off. And so the problem with that system in this modern environment is that it's almost continually activated. So things like driving in traffic, or using electronic media at night, or not getting only 6 hours of sleep when we really mostly need 7 to 8, those all activate the stress response system. And so many of us are going around with a continual activation of that system, and that leads to a lot of physiological changes that eventually cause disease. And so I think a big change that many of us can make, if we're not doing this stuff already, is to actively take steps to either reduce the amount of stress that we're experiencing, which isn't always possible, or manage the stress that we can't avoid, and through things like meditation or mindfulness practice or prayer or massage or acupuncture or yoga, or there's so many different ways. It's not really that important what way that you choose. It's more important that you choose something and you stick with it regularly. And I think, especially for people who already have their diet dialed in, that's probably one of the most important things they can do.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time today. Thank you so much, Chris.
It's my pleasure. Take care.
Thanks for listening today. If you like what you heard, please review this podcast on iTunes and let the world know. Also, you can find out more about our guests and today's topic by going to our website, westinaprice.org. Click on the word podcast to find more information and pertinent links. If If you're interested in finding out more about healthy living in general, look for a Weston A. Price chapter near you. Again, go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the sidebar and find a local chapter. You'll find a group of like-minded people in your area that can help you on your journey to optimal health. Again, thanks for listening. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts.